it feels that over the course of the 20th century, we went backwards. So one of the things you see in the 70s is the amount of concrete, the amount of cabling, the amount of steel required in nuclear power stations, rockets. If not now, when? And we're not asking the UK government to, invent something new. The UK used to be the best country in the world at civilian nuclear power.
Welcome to the Free the Power podcast, the IEA's occasional series that looks into free market solutions to energy challenges. Today, I'm joined by Alex Chalmers, the author of the Chalmermagne blog. Is that correct, Alex?
Close enough.
Yeah, so it's one of those exciting blogs that looks into all the fun things outside economics, such as technology and finance and different forms of energy, but things that are essential to delivering affordable, abundant supply of the thing that drives the entire economy. So, Alex, tell us a little bit more about that blog and also your work with Works in Progress.
Sure. So I actually started Chalmermagne last year when I was working for a venture capital firm, and I kept running into policymakers, investors, and sort of people interested in some of these questions, and found there was this sort of consistent failure to really apply kind of market thinking and ideas about incentives to lots of these different policy questions, and eventually drove me into just such a fury that I eventually became, unfortunately, one of the many, many people who decided that they should start a Substack. And so kind of writing so far has included sort of deep dives into how the UK government subsidises private markets, an examination about why the UK's National AI Institute the Alan Turing Institute has been a catastrophic failure, and shortcomings in UK defence strategy. But the Substack is essentially a hobby and a side hustle and something I do to while away the evenings in my spare time. So my main work at the moment is with Works in Progress, which is a magazine based on the idea that ideas matter and can make a difference. So I think the team feels and felt when they started the magazine that a lot of the conversation about policy, whether that's in Westminster, Brussels, or DC, is quite stale, it's quite fatalistic. It focuses on the same sort of set of rather unimaginative levers. And the idea is that you can sort of bring in bold, radical, but also workable ideas. So if you look at our latest issue, we have pieces about how, you can remove lead in a lot of the developing world, which is something that could affect hundreds of millions of lives better. Fast track drugs for humans based on lifting some of the principles used in animal drug approvals, or connect up just railway networks with just very small tunnels and kind of create these new sort of powerful citywide metros. And the focus of my work at Works in Progress is less that, and is almost entirely on nuclear power and how we can, we used to be good at building it, how we can return to kind of doing that, and how cheap, abundant energy can make our lives better, but also facilitate things like the AI revolution that everyone's talking about at the moment.
So let's go into that a bit more. So you wrote reasonably recently about this topic, specifically how we got into this mess where nuclear power is extremely expensive in the first place. And perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes. So nuclear power is frustratingly one of those areas where it feels that over the course of the 20th century, we went backwards. If you go back to kind of late 1950s, 1960s, when the world first started building civilian nuclear power, including the UK, it was possible to license, approve, and build a new nuclear reactor in 5, 6, 7 years. I think the only places that can still do that are South Korea and China. Much of the rest of the world has gone backwards, and a big driver of that has been overregulation. And so I recently wrote a piece that really kind of did a deep dive into the story of how we came to regulate radiation in the wrong way. And a lot of this starts and dates back to these 1920s experiments around fruit flies, of all things. So there was this American scientist called Hermann Muller, who essentially was an early expert in assessing the impact of X-rays on the sperm cells of fruit flies. And he found that...
So that's quite interesting. So one wonders how one gets into that profession. You're sitting there one day thinking, I'm a scientist, I'm going to look into something interesting. I know I'm going to look at fruit flies, particularly their reproductive system.
Well, fruit flies are really popular among geneticists because they have a really short life cycle, so you can study the effects of something on them, and they reproduce in great numbers. So they're actually a geneticist's dream come true. So Drosophila, as they're known, have been a common sort of study subject for basically since the early days of the field. And so he noticed that when he fired X-rays, highly concentrated X-rays at their sperm cells, you'd see these mutations, and they would be.
So just to be clear, though, this is 1920s pre-nuclear weapons.
This is
pre-nuclear.
X-rays were just kind of discovered in the 1890s. Radiation is beginning to become a fashionable tool in medicine, but the idea of nuclear weapons, nuclear power is still some way off. But this is still where a lot of the kind of science behind this starts, is these early experiments that find, we fired a load of radiation, we've seen these hereditable effects that scale with radiation dose. Could this have an implication for people?
Just to be clear, so hereditable effect. So an effect of radiation on one generation of fruit flies would then translate into the same effect on their children.
Yes.
Okay. So he's seeing this effect from X-rays, the sort of radiation levels that are you're exposed to during X-ray exposure. Are they similar to nuclear power, or are they a lot?
They are. I mean, this is actually an important point, is that a lot of the science we do around radiation in the 20s, 30s, and then 50s and 60s that hints at these kinds of dangerous effects are significantly higher than the kinds of exposure that you would face if you worked in a nuclear power station or you lived in an area around one. So a lot of our kind of instincts about the harm caused by radiation came from these very, very high dose studies.
So it's real classic mad scientist stuff. So Herm is there in his lab, and he's blasting these little flies with vast amounts of radiation. And to no one's surprise today, these flies are experiencing horrendous effects, including genetic deformities that mean they can't reproduce, or they're reproducing in ways that continue those deformities down generations.
Yeah, and he sort of takes these experiments to make him famous very quickly. He then starts working with these Soviet geneticists in the 1930s, and they conclude that even one hit of radiation is potentially quite dangerous, something that becomes known as the hit model. And then after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he wins the Nobel Prize in 1946. And in his lecture, he declares there is no safe dose of radiation. And this kind of runs against the orthodoxy in radiology circles and medical circles at the time, where there was this sense that there probably is a safe threshold. And he came out and sort of disputed this sort of very aggressively.
So I own a lovely set of uranium glass, and it's a jug for pouring water and a set of glasses. And this was quite fashionable.
Yeah.
I think in the 1930s, 1940s, that disappeared. And is this why?
So it's connected. So in the 1930s, there was radiation was the sort of the cool thing. So you'd have all these sort of radium infused products. You could get radium infused hand wash that the marketing slogan was removes everything but the skin. There was radium infused tonic water that was alleged to have aphrodisiac effects. Although I think one person who tested that to destruction then did die of cancer. And there was, the kind of notorious case of the ladies who painted kind of glow in the dark watch faces with paint and with sort of radium infused paint, and were encouraged to point the brushes using their lips, and a number of them would go on to get sort of rather unpleasant jaw cancer.
So the important point here is that high levels of radiation really are very dangerous.
Yes, you should. If you ingest thousands of millisieverts of radiation, which the radium dial painters were tens of thousands of millisieverts of radiation, that is bad for you. Mm-hmm. Please don't do that. Don't drink radium infused tonic water.
But my uranium glass is probably...
Your uranium glass is probably fine.
And just to be sure, I've got a Geiger counter. It does go up a little bit, but I think it's...
Your body... This is something that we discovered with time that we didn't really know in the 20s and 30s, is your body is also really good at healing the effects of low-dose radiation, which makes sense because considering the number of natural radiation sources there are in the environment. If it wasn't, we'd all die quite quickly.
Well, that's probably why our studio manager Jamie's still alive. I mean, he comes from Cornwall, which is notorious for having higher levels of background radiation than the rest of the UK.
Yeah, it's same. So Cornwall, for example, or if you live in somewhere like Denver, Colorado, you get 4 to 5 times the annual background radiation exposure that you would anywhere else in the US. Or somewhere like Kerala in India, it's potentially in some areas 15 to 20 to 30 times higher than that. And interestingly, never observed higher rates of cancer among those populations, which if
we go back to the 1950s, this still isn't properly understood, or it may be understood differently by different people.
Yes.
And Dr. Muller's got his Nobel Prize. He's come out with this theory that there is no safe level. What effect does this start to have on the emerging nuclear power industry?
So initially, not a huge effect. Sort of civilian nuclear power gets underway in the mid-1950s after Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. But one of the things I found interesting looking at this story is that sort of early civilian nuclear power stations, some people weren't keen on them, weren't really what drove the radiation panic. Instead, I think a lot of it can be attributed to US atomic weapons testing, and that I think the nuclear industry essentially became the somewhat innocent victim of screw-ups the US government made in other places. So civilian nuclear in the US was regulated by this body called the Atomic Energy Commission, and it was unusual in that it had this dual function. It regulated both civilian nuclear power, but also weapons testing. And the US ran over 100 nuclear weapons tests over the course of the 1950s. Many of these were initially quite uncontroversial. They just sort of let off a bomb in the middle of Nevada, and it was actually a sort of source of pride to the locals that they were picked for this honor. And there were others in these South Pacific atolls. But then a couple of things started to go wrong. So there was this test in Nevada that the radiation spread and poisoned and killed a lot of local sheep, which the US government and the AEC sort of hushed up. And there was this notorious one, the Castle Bravo test, which was the largest nuclear weapon the US has ever tested, which was tested in the South Pacific. And they underestimated both the amount of radiation it was going to produce and the wind changed direction just as they were testing it. And it scattered huge amounts of radiation, like significantly more than produced by Hiroshima and Nagasaki over a number of the Marshall Islands, particularly this small island called Rongelap. And it poisoned a number of people that lived there. The US government had to evacuate it. And it also poisoned a Japanese fishing ship that happened to be in the surrounding area. It was
a Lucky Dragon.
The rather unlucky Dragon. And they only realized this after some of its cargo had started being sold in like Japanese fish markets, and this caused a huge panic in Japan. And so like there were these incidents that began to dent trust in the industry.
This is classic government intervention. So we need to make sure things are safe. Therefore, we're going to take charge of these very difficult and dangerous testing projects. When we screw up, we're obviously going to be completely transparent with everybody, tell them exactly what we've done and apologise, or indeed cover everything up and then lead to further problems down the line.
The cover-up was slightly extraordinary. So they claimed that the Lucky Dragon was actually a communist spy ship and that the crew had been injured by chemical reactions in the coral. I mean, they went sort of very... Well, that was the chair of the AEC. So they were kind of solidly in defense mode on some of that stuff. And the effects that had was essentially radicalizing a section of the scientific community, especially geneticists, including Hermann Muller, who was still alive and very much going and was still a vocal advocate for the idea that there was no safe radiation threshold. And amidst all this sort of adverse publicity, the US National Academy of Sciences kind of organizes this big report into the safety of radiation, which is the Biological Effects of Atomic Radiation, or BEAR Committee. Mm-hmm. And it has these two panels. One is made up of the geneticists, including Muller, and they are pushing very, very hard for this idea that there's no safe threshold, harm scales linearly with dose, which is the linear no threshold hypothesis. And there's this other panel of pathologists, and the pathologists just don't really buy it. They go, look, you can't extrapolate, what happens to fruit flies to human beings, and this instinctively just doesn't make sense to us, and we don't buy it based on clinical observation. And in the end, they land on this compromise report, which goes that radiation in peacetime has probably caused harm to relatively few people, despite a couple of unfortunate accidents. But a lot still no safe threshold.
A lot of fruit flies, just to be clear.
A lot of fruit flies were harmed in the making, but this obviously then causes a panic. So the New York Times front page has scientists dub radiation a threat to the future of mankind, and this leads to then another round of criticism of the AEC. So by the kind of end of the 50s, going into the 60s, it's beginning to not look good for fans of radiation.
And this is at the same time culturally that science fiction is emerging as a genre, and I believe there were a large number of nuclear-themed disaster movies.
There were a lot of those. The culture is also, the culture is unfortunate, and I think that was a big part of it. And as the 60s starts to go on, you get the birth of the environmentalist movement as well. That is also sort of.
But this is okay, because we can rely on our brave and noble politicians to resist irrational forces of culture and look at the evidence dispassionately and say it still matters that we need access to affordable, abundant energy.
I mean, I feel like this is where the nuclear industry's gone wrong. We really need a powerful TV drama on the benefits of cheap and abundant energy that, maybe sort of heartwarming to really turn public opinion.
But... So I feel you're alluding there to the fact that they didn't necessarily do that, and they instead did something else. And what is it they then did in the 1970s that caused some of these problems?
Well, I think, you have a kind of few different things. So over the 1960s, we get a load more scientific evidence, essentially pointing to, again, some of the dangers of high-dose radiation, because we start learning more about how chromosomes work. We kind of acknowledge in the early 1960s that maybe fetal X-rays, which have been the norm for the previous decade, aren't a good idea. And then going into the 70s, it all begins to kind of come apart at the seams for nuclear energy in the West. So for a start, the US begins bulking up environmental regulation under Richard Nixon of all people. So you have the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and these sort of mandatory environmental impact assessments become the norm. And so even as the 70s start, you begin to see regulation ramping up. And then in 1975, the US adopts this principle known as ALARA, or as low as reasonably achievable, which is this idea that sort of exposure to ionizing radiation, which is the kind of radiation produced by X-rays, CT scans, or will be produced as a side effect of what happens in nuclear power stations, should be kept as low as is reasonably achievable. And this is based on kind of further big scientific reports that have come out.
I mean, that sounds okay. It sounds like you want to prioritize safety, and as long as it's not totally unreasonable, then wouldn't this be a good thing? Isn't this the government looking after the public?
Well, it's one of those things that sounds very reasonable in theory, but the devil, as ever, is in the detail. And often what ALARA implementation turns into is taking these things that are basically tiny, tiny, tiny risks to people. We're talking about further minimizing these very low doses of radiation and imposing disproportionately high costs on people trying to build nuclear power stations. Because if you're the regulator, which by the mid-1970s, the AEC has been abolished and replaced by this body called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US that does not have this kind of promotional role for energy and is much more assertively independent. You get nothing if there's a successful nuclear rollout if you're an independent regulator. But if something goes wrong, you get all of the blame. So you are just incentivized to always optimize for safety narrowly defined as much as possible. So one of the things you see in the 70s is the amount of concrete, the amount of cabling, the amount of steel required in nuclear power stations, rockets, so sort of doubles, triples. The amount of time required to complete them goes up. The cost increases by 176% over the course of a decade. Regulators keep asking for work to be redone, for the layouts of plants to be changed. And this is really bad for the industry on two levels. There's one, it's the extra engineering work. It requires more time and it requires more materials. But also, nuclear power construction is usually debt financed. So every single delay causes the cost of the interest you have to pay on the money you've borrowed to build the power station to go up and up and up. So it makes privately building nuclear power in the US prohibitively expensive. And then things get worse again in 1979 after there's this partial meltdown of a reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Now, no one is hurt by the radiation produced by this accident. We've never been able to find anyone.
And this time, genuinely no one was hurt. This isn't just another cover-up by the government.
No, it's that genuinely, we've not been able to find any evidence that people who lived around the reactor suffered. And much the same as happened with Fukushima in 2011, is that people died in the panicked evacuation, but no one died as a result of the radiation. And this led to then another kind of wave of regulatory ramp-ups. So nuclear build-outs basically stop in the US in the 1980s. Like people just begin abandoning it, and you start getting all these kind of post-mortems on why nuclear went wrong in the US start appearing in the kind of late 70s and 80s, and it sort of begins to be forgotten.
So what's happening in summary is that something designed to be like a precautionary principle, ALARA,
Yes.
is in fact turning into a zero-risk principle.
Yes.
And that zero risk manifests itself through a total denial of trade-offs.
Yes.
And that includes, for example, increasing the amount of steel and concrete and stuff in nuclear power stations, which may even mean, given the mining involved in that the amount of radiation emitted in the process of building these much larger stations would actually be higher than the amount of radiation they were likely to emit in normal operating circumstances.
Yeah, the regulators never seem very interested in that bit of the equation. And in the US's defense, they eventually kind of settle on it's as low as reasonably achievable, and there is a kind of they have become better at acknowledging the trade-offs, and they start setting these kind of prescribed thresholds and targets and checklists where if you do X, Y, and Z, you are ALARA compliant. In the UK, however, we take a slightly different approach. So in the UK, it's called ALARP, as low as reasonably practicable, instead of ALARA, for it's sort of a semantic difference. And we actually introduced it a year earlier than the US as part of this big overhaul of workplace health and safety. So we move nuclear from being regulated by the wonderfully named Ministry of Power, where ministers signed off on site licenses. There was a small inspectorate originally of 13 people that licensed the UK's huge nuclear builder. And we move it into the Health and Safety Executive, and they're meant to be the independent regulator, and they spit out the Office for Nuclear Regulation in the 2010s. And they take a slightly different approach. They go, well, ALARP is that, they take what's called a goals-based approach to regulation, which is you should always be trying to go further. Like, we have a statutory limit, but that limit isn't a target. You should be trying to exceed it, and we can mandate you to exceed it if we want to. So this creates a really, really kind of intense ratchet in the UK that's only worsened with times. And
you had quite a good example of that, I think, in the opening to the piece.
Yes. So this happened in the UK. So there's this design called the Advanced Boiling Water Reactor that's built by this joint venture between General Electric and Hitachi, and a few of these exist in Japan. And one of them has been hit by a worse earthquake, the sort of a greater earthquake than it's ever hit the UK in basically recorded time, as far as I can tell. And there were no unsafe radiation leaks as a result. But
these are proper earthquakes, not fracking earthquakes.
Yeah, no, real proper hardcore earthquakes. And they tried to build this design in the UK, and the Office for Nuclear Regulation.
And this is in Wales.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Office for Nuclear the project's since been abandoned, and it was called Horizon. And the Office for Nuclear Regulation were like, you see your air conditioning system. We're not happy. We are going to mandate you to put these special souped up safety filters on all of the ducts sort of around it, even though this will, and GE had had, and they were like, well, you need this both for emergencies and to improve safety during routine use. And the HVAC system is not part of how GE Hitachi imagined.
So we've got a Japanese system that works and can get built in 4 to 6 years. And they want to bring that over to the UK over a decade ago. And the government regulator responsible for approving nuclear design says Japan's standards are not good enough.
Yes.
And is this based on any evidence of lower safety standards?
So no, it's more about their this understanding of what they consider to be established good practice, and they will, which is based on a mixture of international standards, their own rules, and past precedent. And so they found both the filtration on the air conditioning system, they didn't like it. They insisted that concrete barriers get built between bits of the residual heat removal system, which is something that neither the US nor Japanese regulators asked for. So they asked for a bunch of sort of over-engineered sort of changes and solutions to, as far as I could tell, were relatively imaginary safety problems.
This is. I mean, gold plating is the wrong word. Lead plating.
This is a big problem in UK nuclear. Is that because, and you get this dynamic is the regulator will kind of reject your design, or the inspector will say that they're not happy with it, and so you'll go away and you'll come up with this kind of gold plated, over-engineered solution in the hope you can get it past them, and then you'll then go out and complain, look, I had to do this gold-plated engineered solution, and the regulator will go, well, that's your fault. We didn't make you do that. We just rejected all the alternatives, but you proposed the gold-plated solution.
And then the Treasury will say, this is far too expensive, and we can't possibly give you any sort of support system that will get this built.
Yeah, I think essentially the pool of people who are able to build nuclear is very, very small as a result. Is if you look at something like Hinkley Point C, which is going to be the most expensive nuclear power station built anywhere in the world in the history of nuclear power, EDF could afford to go through the endless series of design changes and delays because ultimately, they have the backing of the French state. If you were kind of a normal private company trying to build a nuclear power station, it would just be impossible because you would just not have the balance sheet and the reserves to handle a sort of.
And all of this, just to be clear, I believe you noted that Hitachi said that the amount of radiation exposure that would be saved was akin to eating one banana.
Yeah, well, I think it was roughly. So they claim that in normal course of operations that yes, this would adding these sort of souped up filters to the HVAC ducts would, but yes, 0.1 microsieverts, which is roughly what you get from the potassium inside a banana, which your body will heal from the effects of within seconds.
Just to be clear to listeners, bananas are safe. You are safe to eat bananas.
You can eat bananas. I'm sure if the ONR were here, they go, well, what about in the event of an emergency? Maybe these filters would be really, really useful, but. Yeah, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, the reactor has filled these fancy filters in a bunch of other places in the design, and a bunch of other emergency systems that they'd actually sort of built to handle a meltdown, and they weren't going to rely on the air conditioning ducts as the kind of critical line of defense.
So they pulled out.
Yeah, they did. It was for somewhat unrelated corporate reasons, but yes, they eventually sort of abandoned the design. There was a big back and forth with the Treasury about securing more funding, but they eventually cut their losses and moved on.
Okay, so we've talked a lot then about what has caused the problem, and at the root of that analysis is a an effort to create safety standards that are absurdly high.
Yes.
To the detriment both of the industry, but also of the public, because they then don't get access to affordable energy.
And it's not even just that, because if you think about it, we can actually measure, the deaths that result from burning fossil fuels and the particulates. We kill far more people than radiation are killed by the particulates from burning gas. But this again does not get factored into the calculation
because the Office for Nuclear Regulation,
it's not their responsibility.
It's not regulate coal mines.
But it's not their job to care about trade-offs like this.
So, what are the solutions? If we go back to work in progress's principal founding mission.
So, I think on ALARA itself, my honest view is that I think it's going to be very, this principle is so embedded in global radiological protection that I think it will be very, very hard to shift it. But where and kind of abandon it, the world is never, sadly, I think it's unforeseeable that the world will go, we're not doing ALARA anymore. But what I think I'm more optimistic about is, I think we can encourage regulators to apply it in a somewhat more flexible way, as they have done in a couple of countries. So France, for example, built nuclear very effectively. It technically adopted ALARA in the 1980s, and French nuclear began to become more expensive over the course of the 1980s, but significantly cheaper than building nuclear power is today. South Korea technically has ALARA, but you can still license and build a nuclear plant affordably and crucially repeatably in South Korea. So I think there is scope to kind of break the ratchet somewhat. And the thing we have going for us in the moment in the UK is this government announced a task force at the start of the year, the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force, chaired by great enemy of vested interests, John Fingleton. And they're essentially examining a bunch of these questions to go can we make nuclear cheaper and quicker in the UK? And I think we obviously don't know what this task force is going to say, but we do know, I think, that the government has given them the space to be radical. So hopefully they'll come back with a punchy set of recommendations. The Prime Minister has been clear that he's on the side of builders, not blockers. So when that task force's report comes later in the year, Number 10 will have the opportunity to show us if they really mean it.
Well, they might really mean it, but what we've learned about this government so far is that when there is a reaction, their minds can be changed. And is it likely that the far left of Parliament, which traditionally has been opposed to nuclear power, despite claiming to be environmentally interested and aware, is it likely that they would be able to mount a rebellion that could block any changes to nuclear regulation?
So I suppose it's theoretically possible, but at the same time, the government has just indicated that it's going to provide the funding for Sizewell C. I think there is a realization that, the energy system in this country is broken, that, we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world, and something's got to give. But I take your point. The government genuinely has a moment to be really radical. If you look at kind of public opinion, public is increasingly kind of warming to the idea of nuclear power. But I think there's definitely more that we can do, and I think we can learn from other countries on some of this. So if you look at something like nuclear power construction, it's often unpopular initially locally, but popular in the long term because people see the economic benefits. And one of the big problems we have in the UK is that we ask communities to bear all the costs of development for uncertain long-term benefits. So if a nuclear power station is built near you, or a data center or any other piece of infrastructure is built near you, the local authority, it collects tax as a result. All that money is then sent back to the central government. But if you look at, for example, France in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, when a nuclear power station was built in a local area, the community got really, really rich as a result. So the local authority would retain a huge amount of the kind of revenue produced by it, and would then use that to kind of cut rates in some areas down to as low as 0.1%, build new infrastructure. EDF would, France's national energy company, would also build local infrastructure. So these would then become quite popular developments locally. Japan also understandably, given its history, there was a lot of wariness about civilian nuclear power among communities. But again, communities got essentially bought off with huge quantities of subsidy and new infrastructure. And this is something that the UK hasn't historically done. And so I think there's scope for, as well as kind of fixing this kind of the scientific questions and the regulation, making development much more popular at a local level. And I feel like quite a lot of this could be done without passing reams of primary legislation. And it's something that, I think we're all hoping that government thinks more seriously about, because it would have positive benefits. It wouldn't just be good for nuclear, it would be good for all kinds of other sorts of infrastructure.
Okay, so in general, you're optimistic.
Well, I think if you look at the history of civilian...
As near as reasonably achievable.
As optimistic as is practicable, I think, is that, I think if not now, when? Mm-hmm. And, we're not asking the UK government to, invent something new. The UK used to be the best country in the world at civilian nuclear power. In the 1960s, the UK had more reactors than, the US and France put together. So this isn't about, some radical, wild departure. It's the UK getting back to something it used to be pretty good at, and clearing some unnecessary obstacles that have no benefit to public health out of the way. So it should be done. And to be honest, it's the kind of thing that you almost think a centre-left government should be better at doing. Not because they're necessarily instinctively more, sympathetic, but because I think it is easier for a government of the centre-left to do kind of bold, difficult things on regulation and the environment than a government of the centre-right or right.
Well, you exposed Richard Nixon as one of the architects of the problem.
Richard Nixon, closet environmentalist.
Massively popular otherwise, but just that one flaw in his history. Okay, so we've talked about ALARA changing but not vanishing.
Yes.
Which to me sounds a little like applying the innovation principle to what is a precautionary system. We've talked about local incentives.
Yes.
Which I confess I'm still a little sceptical of, because that was a major driver behind trying to make fracking acceptable. And it was very explicit on that occasion, with 1% of revenue being allocated to the local community to use as it saw fit. And we are reliant on the British public recognising that however they feel about anything being built in their backyard, there has to be a path to more affordable energy. That all the incentives for that change to happen are there. But if it doesn't happen quickly, it means that we're not going to build nuclear power in this country fast enough, doesn't it?
I mean, if we don't get this right, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, firstly, it will create more Hinkley Point Cs, which I think everyone in the industry agrees that this is not the way nuclear power should be built.
It's an ALARA power station.
Yeah.
What year are we in now? 18, 19?
It's insane. It's quite many sites. It was actually first proposed in 1981 and then got variously dropped and picked up by successive governments. But yeah, it's quite sad. If you go back to the mid-2000s, and so they kind of start reviving the idea of nuclear power as a way of hitting climate goals. And there's optimism that we could have it finished by 2015. And yeah, obviously that's not happened. But I think, yeah, if we don't get this right, I think, yes, there may be more nuclear power, but it will be produced very expensively by incumbents, and there'll be kind of very little innovation to make it cheaper. But I think, importantly, the UK will miss its climate goals. We will not get there. We will not get there through wind and solar alone. And I think, and the challenge of kind of wind and solar is that obviously their proponents like talking about them as if they're cheap energy, but these are intensely subsidized. They are bad for the grid, and require all this kind of extra infrastructure to be built. And all of that cost is loaded onto bill payers.
Well, like the nuclear industry, we have promised to hit a target of around 20 minutes this podcast, and we're somewhere closer to double that at the moment. So I'm going to draw the conversation to a close. So thank you very much, Alex. That was a fascinating walk through a very complicated piece of history, but a very important piece of history, and one in which the current government, we hope, has learnt some valuable lessons. And we're all waiting with anticipation for what that task force report is going to say. So fingers crossed for a more rational policy in future. So if you'd like to find out more about Alex's work, do look at the Works in Progress site. Do look at his other blog, Chalmermagne, and do subscribe to the IEA Insider to get regular updates from us and listen to other interesting thinkers like Alex. So thank you very much.